The next question comes from the r/HighStrangeness subreddit user KrustyKrab8. Is there any publicly available footage outside of the standard 2017 New York Times article videos that stands out as confirmation of the phenomenon?
I would say yes. Since that original opening up of the issue, we've had other whistleblowers coming forward that have spoken to more and more aspects of the phenomena. As I mentioned earlier, Dave Grush, one of the highest level intelligence officers that I'm familiar with, who did a fantastic behind the scenes investigation of this, comes forward and says there is absolute proof of a, quote, so-called legacy program. It's important that to recognize that not only did he appear in front of Congress under oath to describe this, but he also presented the data to the Inspector General of the Department of Defense and the Inspector General of the intelligence community. And the latter individual came forth and said this information is credible and important. So when I pick up things like that along the way, I would say that this amounts to further plus points on the scale that begin to weigh that there really is something to this by people whose word you can take for granted. And I've had the opportunity to talk to high-level individuals, like generals and so on, who've been involved, who claim to have been involved in the program. I can't find any reason to set that aside. So these things that we run into as we move along in the program, I take to all sum up saying, it's the real deal.
Can I jump in here, Hal? Because, Lou Elizondo has, of course, stated many times publicly that the ATIP program has many videos that are even superior, far superior to the gimbal, for instance, which is probably the best of the three we've seen so far. And I'd like to know, like, when you were very closely involved with the ATIP program, were you able to see any of these highly, these better videos? And do you believe that there are some still from that program that should be or could be released?
The answer is yes. I visited Lou Elizondo there in the Pentagon and as part of the ATIP program, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, and got to see videos, some of them, and of course, under really pristine conditions. One of the reasons that many of these videos have not been released is because of the location of where they were taken and under what circumstances and in what battle situations they were taken and so on. And they're of unbelievably high quality. So I hope that some of these will come out in the future, and I think they probably will as time goes on. But anyway, yes, the answer is yes. There are additional videos that would be, I believe, pretty persuasive to anybody who got to see them, taken under extraordinary conditions by official government operations.
So isn't there any way they could release even part of those or somehow redact? I don't know how well you can redact on video, but somehow remove the sensitive parts and just let people see the actual craft that's in the videos?
I can't think of any reason why that would not be the case. And I anticipate that as time goes on, eventually that will be the case.
Our next question comes from the r/HighStrangeness subreddit from username dmacerz. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. They say, "Hi, Hal, you once spoke about the decision to not tell the public that was made with a group of people and adding up all of the pros and cons. Can you release any more info about the pros and cons of disclosure, or just specifically why would disclosure have been bad back then? Thank you."
Yes, early on in my participation in these kind of programs, I was invited to participate in a conference At this particular time, I wasn't even told what the conference was about, but that I had to come because it was going to be the most important conference I'd ever participated in. So, okay. And so when I got there, myself and other people I knew from the intelligence community, from the DoD, and elsewhere. And I was told at the beginning that there was underway a plan to possibly reveal and disclose the fact that non-human intelligence was true, and there were crafts that had been retrieved under a crash retrieval program. And the question was, if given that this is supposedly the case, both Russia, China, ourselves, and so on had this kind of information, should this be disclosed to the American public? Well, I think everyone there, including myself, said, oh my God, absolutely. They said, okay, well, the way we're going to approach this, we're going to make up a list of all the things that would be affected by such a disclosure. So we made a long list. You start out with, okay, stock market might be affected, religious views might be affected, countries' military aspects might be affected. So make a long list. We got some 60 items or something like this. When you finally get down to the weeds on this list, it was sort of like, okay, if we find out that Corporation A got access to materials from a crash retrieval program, but their competitor at Corporation B didn't, when this gets revealed, Corporation B is going to sue Corporation A. They're going to sue the government. This is going to be an absolute disaster situation. And so at the time, as we went through all that and added up all the numbers, as a group, we came to the conclusion that, there's hardly any way to do this because there's so much involved, first. And then secondly, there's no way to handle it piecemeal. You'd have to deal with everything all at once. And so at the time, like this was back some decades, it just seemed that, especially given that the whole subject area was still tinfoil hat and kind of subject with a lot of stigma associated with it, there's just no way to go forward with this. Now, that's in the past. Now, as we now see in the present, there's been a new approach, which was that, first of all, data has come out. The government has pretty much admitted that there's something to it all without giving any level of details. But nonetheless, we had an amendment proposed in Congress by Senator Schumer, who is, majority leader in the Senate, and Republican Senator Rounds, which they put out a multi-page document to be passed called the Disclosure Act, the 2023 Disclosure Act. And if you can believe it, in an actual government document, you have non-human intelligence mentioned over 20 times, and how this had to be addressed in some straightforward fashion. And so they come up with a whole list of ways to do that, having a presidential panel, having all the information passed on to the National Archives, to go through a process of saying what can be released when, and so on. I think that's a good amendment. It didn't pass in 2023, so they put the same amendment forward in 2024. I think once again it got shot down. But anyway, we have a map of how to do that. And so I think done correctly and under the right circumstances, I think the result is different today. And also the stigma that's associated with the area is now pretty much long gone, and for good reasons, by the way. I mean, back, 20, 30, 40 years ago, when we were into this, what was our data? Our data was some farmer seeing something flash across the sky. Then you had to decide, was he drunk, or was this the real deal, or whatever. But in the intervening decades, we now have the most unbelievable sensor systems up there. Forward-looking infrared radar, Aegis-type instrumentation on ships, And so our sensor program has advanced so far that now you have multiple sensors, including pilots and eyes on, all reporting exactly the same thing and all the data correlating, that there's just no room anymore to say this isn't happening. So I think if we reconsider the idea that disclosure should come forth at the present time, I think I don't think there's any way we can avoid it if it's done correctly.
Our next question comes from the HighStrangeness subreddit from MugaCat. The question is, what data collection methods are being used to investigate these UAPs? I think we kind of covered this a little bit. Is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think I've named most everything I can think of, including acoustic signatures as well. Yeah.
Our next question comes from the HighStrangeness subreddit from Athena-Pallas. Will Hal Puthoff ever talk about what he knows? Would you consider writing a book to be published posthumously?
Posthumously, right? Yeah, I've thought about it. My family is pushing me to do it. Of course, there are a lot of books out there already about everything I've done. So, but in terms of postulating or actually putting in print what I know from being involved in these programs, I'm still a patriot, and I still follow the laws of national security establishment. And so if something is being kept back under secrecy, I'm not going to violate that. So even in a posthumously published book, I would not say things that I've convinced are national security secrets. So I might do that, but if somebody's looking forward to reading it, to suddenly have everything spring out from behind the scenes, that probably wouldn't be the case, although it'd be pretty spicy.
Our next question comes from the HighStrangeness subreddit from a user Substantial Pressure 3. They say, I've heard about Dr. Segala's sensors, and I know that Dr. Garry Nolan studied the brains of government employees and contractors who were injured by close contact with UAPs. Was any of that data ever used in conjunction with Dr. Nolan's work? Has Dr. Nolan seen that data? And also, where can I find those interviews that Dr. Nolan did about his research, the research comparing Havana syndrome and the injuries suffered after UAP exposure? They seem to have completely disappeared.
Well, it
So I
seems to
guess a
be a
little bit for
question
Garry too.
for, yeah, it seems to be a question more for Garry, but I will tell you that, I spent a lot of time with this same medical professional studying a lot of the cases from the Havana syndrome. And it seemed that a lot of the cases that we originally studied back in 2015, 2016, which, or, bona fide observations of UFOs had the same look and feel and the same characteristics as the Havana syndrome patients. And there was a great article or a great report by the National Academy of Sciences that detailed exactly what they found. And you could put our research and their research side by side and have the same thing. So if Garry wants to weigh in on what he used for data on his experiments.
Just to be careful, we didn't do any experiments on any individuals. First of all, that would require an institutional review board, et cetera. But we did look at a lot of the MRIs and associated clinical data of many of these individuals. There were at least, the 100 or so that started, as I've said before, perhaps only about 10 or 15 at the end were somehow related to anomalous events, meaning like UAP or some kind of encounter, as opposed to the majority of them, which could have been easily classified as Havana syndrome. Now, interestingly, the same kinds of obfuscation techniques that are being used around UAP have been used around Havana syndrome. And it appears that Representative Turner, one of the reasons he might have been removed from his position on the Oversight Committee of Intelligence was because of how others were annoyed that he was blocking access to the information around just Havana syndrome. So it seems like the playbook is reused in that context. As to the question of things that might or might not have been removed, I haven't removed any podcasts that I've been on. They might just get removed from disuse or somebody's website goes down or something. I've never felt suppressed around that. I think what was good about Havana syndrome, to the extent that it's good, the information getting out about it, is that there's now a whole class of people who were being ignored, who are now, there actually is, from the Health and Human Services, there is now actually a book out about anomalous health incidents. And that is fantastic, that all of the efforts that we put into it over the last decade, there's now, and that booklet outlines for people the steps you can take as a government associated employee, military, intelligence, or otherwise, to be seen through the government associated health system. It lays out who you call, et cetera. So whether or not you're talking about Havana syndrome or some of the things that Jim's techniques can look for evidence that something might be happening to you, or you're talking about something else, there is now a well laid out path because of the efforts of many people to open that up. I have one of Jim's early devices at my house, and to my knowledge, nothing has ever clicked on that Jim has called me about and said, "You got to watch out, duck."
Our next question comes from the HighStrangeness subreddit from FlipsnGiggles. I love these names. What are the potential risks, both physical and environmental, associated with the experimental or practical use of scalar energy? Are there any documented cases of harm or guidelines to mitigate these risks?
I don't know of any documented cases, but I would say that if this scalar energy is something that is out there and it's used, and we have actually used it in a lot of to some extent, if that's available to nature, if our brains had the ability to use this thing, you can bet that nature will evolve this into us and use it for communications or whatever. So I don't know of, is there any harm of using it or experimenting with it? I'd say that us as humans, we probably are very used to it if it actually exists. And there's probably no harm unless we start to change it in a way that makes it different than what our bodies have been used to.
From the HighStrangeness subreddit, from user irrelevantappelation, during your recent interview on engaging the phenomenon, you explained that due to the difficulties discussing UFOs, especially the most academically disruptive woo aspect of the phenomenon, you believe starting with more nuts and bolts, scientifically credible elements might be necessary before opening the floor for broader inquiry, comparing the release of information regarding UFOs to giving children sharp knives and highlighting the need for proper preparation before revealing what had the potential to cause chaos. On this basis, and knowing the public have not been told what's going on by those who know, how do we know this is actually to protect us from societal collapse and not to prevent those who control what we know from losing that control?
Wow. So thank you very much for that question. That had about 10 layers in it. First, I want to thank you and I want to thank the Reddit community for frankly, their professionalism. If you often want to go anywhere to follow up on a subject matter, the various forums and subforums of subreddit, I lurk. I don't often answer anymore. But anyway, so thank you very much for that question. All right. So the first part of that, as to what it is that we should be studying first, I want to disclaim for myself, I'm not uninterested in the many areas of so-called woo. It's just that, as some of the prior questions to Jim and Hal relate, is how do you approach the science of doing an experiment with it? And so, as a scientist, I mean, my way of thinking is I isolate the thing I'm exploring from as many different unwanted perturbations as possible. I perturb in the way that I think is relevant, and I look for a response, And I hope that somewhere between the perturbation and the response, nothing else interfered, such as was mentioned before, a psychosomatic response. So isolating that. And so I don't know necessarily how to isolate, or at least at the beginning, the so-called woo experiments in the fields that I work on. But look, those kinds of experiments have been done for decades, and Hal was instrumental in the Stargate program for designing experiments that made sure you didn't inadvertently let some data slip into the experiment that would cause the percipient to claim that they saw something when in fact it was actually a mistake. So, but I also have to be realistic about what it is that my scientific colleagues will accept. And so, even in my standard science, the work that I do every day, for instance, long ago, I said, hey, I can make retroviruses in 3 days rather than 3 months. And I told this to the guy who had originally created the technique that made it in 3 months and a Nobel Prize winner. And they said, oh, it ain't going to work. And I said, okay, well, I'll try it. They didn't laugh at me, but it didn't. So you have to do the experiments. But once I showed that it could work, now all retroviruses are basically made by that technique. So you have to have experimental protocols that you can trust, that you can show somebody else it will work. But once you burn that pipeline and you show people that, hey, this is true, it sort of opens the door for other questions to be asked. And so, I and Sol, for instance, are very interested in the experiencer issue because the majority of the stories out there are from experiencers. But you have to be very careful when you're talking about what people experience, because you're really getting very close to a medical experiment or psychosocial. And I'm not a psychiatrist, and so I want to be very careful about those kinds of things. And so, but by showing that, at least at the beginning, it's okay to talk about materials research. It's okay to do analysis of data that I was brought on people who claim to have been harmed, and that I can come to limited, I wouldn't call them conclusions, but at least provide data and then some framing of how one could interpret what that data means. And then showing everybody, okay, this is okay. And Nolan didn't get boiled in oil for having done it, although I do occasionally get boiled in oil. But and then more people have gotten involved. And for me, that is fantastic, because just like with the Havana syndrome, once it became obvious that it was something worth studying and the government got involved, I didn't have to do it anymore. And so, the whole idea is to not be the person in control of all of it, but to give other people the tools and the permission structure that they can do it. So I would love to eventually, before my whatever career ends, publish a paper in Nature that says the woo is real, or something to that effect. But, until that time, science is always done incrementally by small steps. My former mentor, David Baltimore, when I was at MIT, Nobel Prize winner, who actually discovered how retroviruses replicate. I remember in group meeting, people talking about, well, this correlates with that correlates, the correlation. And in my prior lab, we didn't ever really talk about correlation. I said, why are we talking about correlation so much? Why is it all? He says, because Garry, and interesting word choice, because I still remember it, data and results in isolation are phenomena. But when you can relate something to prior knowledge with correlation, you are relating it to the total foundation of human knowledge. So you have to build the castle piece by piece. And that makes total sense. And so, it's those little snippets of teaching and wisdom that you get across your career that you embody and say, this is a principle by which I approach it. So that's really the reason why you take step by step. And then, frankly, as well, there's only so much any one person can do. And the whole idea of creating a permission structure for other people to do it is to be able to bring in others to help. And they are. I mean, just look at the literal cottage industry of organizations that have now sprouted up. And Sol is taking some hand in helping to coordinate intergroup discussions, because Sol doesn't want to do it all. And so it's, I think that's really the value of how we're taking this.
Our next question comes from the HighStrangeness subreddit from ChessBoxer4. One of the biggest obstacles to disclosure seems to be the impact upon the collective perception of science and scientific authority, which has declared the chances NHI are here so minute as to be basically unworthy of consideration. If disclosure makes many of our scientists look incompetent or ineffective, and most importantly, unscientific, how will that impact the scientific community and the collective perception of science?
Well, the first thing I would say, it is the job of the scientist to be wrong every day. Because tomorrow, after you figured one thing out, you're going to figure out that yesterday you were wrong. And so, yes, I think there will be a lot of "I told you so." I think there will be a lot of head scratching and a lot of pushback. There's still people today who think the Earth is flat. But scientists do have a way of adapting. And so I'm not that depressed about what will happen to the credibility of scientists. I think it's going to be up to the scientists who are willing to convert based on data and results to say, okay, well, this is worth my time to look into. I've taken the time because I've already achieved what I needed to in my career. And so I find the question of whether or not there is something here fascinating. And for all the reasons that Hal laid out and all the people that I've spoken to, I can't see that many people lying about it across a decade and keeping the story straight. So I think it's worth the effort. And what I'm pleased with are not only the number of scientists who come up to me at meetings and say, "Thank you for doing this. Would you actually talk about it publicly, at this meeting?" But also the emails that I get just thanking me. Hundreds of emails and dozens from scientists saying, "This is really exciting. How can I help?" So I think there's probably a lot of people who, only because of stigma, don't want to admit that they think it's real. Not because they have anything against it. Yeah, there's a bunch of people who are just, sticks in the mud. And that's just, but those people are important as well to have in a scientific community, to basically act as the guardrails to make sure that you don't overconclude.
That's a great point. Jim, did you have something you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, I just want to kind of augment what Gary's talking about. The stat I heard not too long ago was that over 70% of the population of the world have claimed to have an experience of some unknown phenomena. So when you start thinking about, is it really possible that they're all delusional? And I think what happens is that the scientists will start or are looking at that and saying, well, yeah, I can't decide. I can't say it doesn't exist anymore. Therefore, there's some opportunities to get into some very strange things where it's almost guaranteed to have some form of results better than what they have right now. So I think just the population at large is pulling the scientists into this, maybe kicking and screaming in some cases, but universities are certainly not putting this on, first and foremost. The NIH is not going to do this, but citizen sciences are going to get funding, and people are going to start getting funding for this type of thing. And we're going to start accelerating. I feel that we're going to start seeing more results and more published papers in incredible journals.
We've published on the Council Bluffs material, which wasn't extraordinary from a technical standpoint, but I think we proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that it wasn't the most likely scenario of thermite, because there was no evidence of aluminum oxide anywhere in the sample, or which would have been what you would have expected. And we've studied a number of other materials that are very odd. We're now studying a material that shows some very interesting structure at the nano level. I'm not sure what it means, and the first thing I told the students to do is I said, I want you to go and find every other manufacturing technique that humans know about that might have accidentally made something like this. The last thing you want to do is publish something and then somebody says, oh, you idiot. Here it is in the Metallurgical Journal, 1953, of what would happen. And so, it's easy. For instance, the so-called alien honeycomb from New Mexico, that was, there's a book about it. It looks extraordinary, and I have pieces of it, until you go into the literature and you find out, in fact, that the exact threading loop is actually a fishnet loop, and was used in the 1950s to keep resin in place as you bonded two pieces across aluminum honeycomb for aircraft. It's all there. How you make it, what it is, an actual picture of it. And so it's not alien honeycomb. And so the claimed isotope ratios, you can look at the results and you go, okay, well, I don't know who did this mass spectrometry, but those are clearly di and triatomics. They just basically didn't know what they were doing. And so, I don't like being the person to come to the table and saying, well, it's garbage, or you misinterpreted it. All I want to do is say, okay, well, let's look at it again the right way.
Well, our next question is from the R High Strangeness, and it is Girl of 100 Lists is the user. Same girl. Experiencers often describe entering altered states of consciousness during UAP encounters. Do you think these states are key to understanding the phenomena, and could tools like meditation or psychedelics provide controlled environments for further study?
So I think there are two elements to that question. One is the state imposed by the phenomenon, and is the person perceiving exactly what happened, or is it something being transmitted into their mind? So that it doesn't matter whether it actually happened or not, but if somebody has the capability to transmit such, an experience into your mind, it's as good as it having happened in the first place. It still is, to me, evidence, if you will, of something extraordinary. So that's the first thing. The second is then the flip side of the question, which is there something about the percipient, either their state of mind, meditation, or some enabled state of mind, use of psychedelics, that allows the brain to accept information in a manner that is that it wouldn't normally have access to. Whether it's something like remote viewing or clairvoyance, or the 50th generation of Neuralink from Musk's great grand it. So I don't have a problem imagining, for instance, appropriate manipulation of electromagnetics that could make people perceive and hear words, or perceive and hear questions if you were sufficiently advanced. Where and how you would access that in the brain and how it's done and how it's focused, I have no clue. But I don't have a problem thinking that it would happen in the future. But I also know that our brains and the proteins and the atoms of which they're composed sit in the matrix of space-time. And we're all just interacting with each other via quantum fields. I have no problem, just as Hal alluded to at the beginning, that there might be field structures or patterns or things that we are not fully aware of yet that are also a part of space-time that can be used to transmit information from one place to another without electromagnetics. What fascinates me, though, is that when people have these experiences or get these ideas, they come in almost all at once, like the remote viewing. When I've done a couple of remote viewing with actually Ed May, the images that I got were kind of all at once images. And so it wasn't like it came in by Morse code and I decoded the Morse code, dot, 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 blip, blip. It just came in all at once like a glyph. So that means that the information came in across the entire structure of whatever it is my consciousness represents and imposed itself within milliseconds. And so I just, to me, that just fascinates me. How does that happen? I asked this at the Soul meeting last November. Can you imagine the level of civilization required to accomplish something like that? Or the level of understanding of the physics of the universe of what it allows to accomplish that? Because if you just ascribe it to magic, well, no one's ever going to figure that out. But if you can basically say, this is what's required to accomplish it, then you can start to think about what kind of instrumentation or physics is required to do that. And then you can back engineer through sort of a form of reverse engineering of how do I get to that? It's kind of like those video games where you have to build this, and this before you can build that. And then you need this, that, and that before you can build the next thing. And so chemists, for instance, reverse engineer the making of a target molecule by figuring out what the sub pieces are that they need to make. And then they say, okay, well, these don't exist. I can't just buy these off the shelf. I have to build these. So now I have to break down how to do that. And you have this synthesis path of how you build up the components. So it's just like I build a satellite, I have to build all the components. So if I want to put a satellite in space, how do I do it? If I want to transmit information from one brain to another, what level of instrumentation do I need? What are the receivers? And, I find psychedelics fascinating as maybe something which enables it's known to turn off they're known to turn off the default mode network. And so maybe that's what's required. Maybe that's why people have experiences mostly when they're sleeping, because the default node network is turned off. They're more receptive to it. So yeah, there probably are. People claim that there are procedures for this, and they claim to interact with things on a regular basis. I think that's another place where citizen science is being put to work. In fact, I know of venture capitalists who are putting money into it. The same kind of venture capitalists that have put money into Skywatcher, because it's risk. They have enough money. They see that the value of the result is not just monetary, but societal. And so they're willing to put that money in almost as if, well, if I lose the money, whatever, that's fine. Let's do it.
Do you think we're going to see something like a gold rush, or like similar to something like with the, .com boom or something like that, with technologies coming from this field?
I hope so. Yes, if the stuff ever gets out, if the alleged materials ever get out. But I think even in the absence of materials ever getting out, or let's say that this is one giant illusion, even if you're only imagining seeing something going at 5,000 miles an hour and taking a left turn, seeing that and saying, I want to do that, is halfway towards figuring out how to do it yourself. And so, all the work that Hal and others have done over the years is exactly that. Man saw birds could fly, so the myth of Icarus was born, and eventually the Wright brothers got it done. But Michelangelo or Da Vinci drew what he thought would be necessary to make a helicopter or something that looked like a helicopter. So people have been thinking about this because they desire the capability, and then they figured out how it is that we can use nature to accomplish that goal.